I, oh.
Sorry about that, Jen. I wanted to make sure I recorded this.
Absolutely, sorry. So my name is Jennifer Jin, an attorney who lives in Monona. Practiced in a large private law firm out of Milwaukee, where I focused on assisting taxpayers in state and local tax matters, including property assessment work, as well as other aspects. Since I moved to Monona when I joined the WEDC as Chief Legal Officer and served there for about 2.5 years, and now working at Briggs & Stratton as in-house counsel. So I'm really pleased to be able to share some of my experience and knowledge in regards to property tax for our community here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking your time to do this. I think there's just a lot of ins and outs, and I know as a city council member and even as a resident, I've gotten so many questions about this process and a lot of confusion about it. So I think this is just so helpful. So a couple housekeeping notes. If you have questions as Jen goes through her presentation, please feel free to post them in the chat and I will ask them as we go along. I'm a big believer that there are no dumb questions. That's how we learn, right? Is asking questions. So please know that your questions will not be met with defensiveness, and we'll do our best. Jen will do her best to answer those questions as best she can. We will wrap up at 6 p.m. I believe that's what we're aiming for, but if it does go over a little bit, feel free, if you need to leave, go for that. We are recording the session and we will distribute that link. I'll put it on my Facebook page, or I know some people have emailed me for the link, and we've gotten requests through Nextdoor and a few other platforms. So we'll do our best to get you that link as well. So I think so once again, just if you can mute yourself, that is really helpful, just to keep the background noise to a minimum. And I think with that, we'll get started.
All right, so I hope everyone can see my screen well. I've got a PowerPoint presentation. The first slide is the agenda. I'm going to cover 5 different points. First, how property tax works in Wisconsin. Second, the importance of uniformity. Third, we're going to go through the process of evaluating your personal. The next part of the presentation will identify resources that you can use to evaluate and understand the property tax system, as well as resources that you can use to evaluate your property assessment. And then finally, how to appeal. Let's get right into it. So how does property tax work? The property tax that we pay is split amongst a number of different taxing jurisdictions. So for example, our property tax goes to our school districts, technical colleges, counties, and municipalities, and special districts. So it's a big piece. So our property tax is made up of a number of different components that helps to fund some of the services that are being provided. You may have heard the term property tax levy. The levy is basically kind of another word for a term of budget. It's the amount that each of these taxing units need to fund the government services for the year. So the way that we determine a property tax levy is that each of these taxing units, for example, the school district, identifies how much they need to pay for the services for the year. Then they subtract out the amount that they will earn through the year to figure out what amount needs to get paid by the property taxes. So that is what a property tax levy is. And I've kind of put a little formula here. So the budget minus their revenue equals how much that needs to get paid by property taxes. So that's the first step, that each of these units identify their levy or their needs. So the next step is that they allocate the property tax burdens to the different municipalities. So let's give this as an example. So we have a school district levy, and here in Monona, we have a school district called Monona Grove. Monona Grove serves both Monona and Cottage Grove. And this is just for example purposes. We're making it really easy. It's not based on real numbers, just an example of how a levy is established. So the first step is that Monona Grove School District identifies their levy. So let's pretend that their levy this year is $50,000. We would wish that, not even close, right? So we've got a $50,000 levy. So the next step after they've determined how much they need to provide their services is to split it amongst the different municipalities they serve. So let's, for argument purposes or example purposes, say that Monona Grove or Monona and Cottage Grove each have identical property assessment values. So let's say that each of the values in these communities are 100,000. So because they're identical, both of these communities will split the levy 50-50. So basically they will each pay $25,000 of the school district levy. And in order to figure out the total property taxes for each community, each of the taxing units does the same thing. It gets split amongst all the different communities that share in that particular the services that are provided. And then that's how the municipality identifies the total amount of levy for the year. So let's go to the next step, which is how is that property tax levy for the municipality allocated to me as an individual property owner? Your property tax is determined based on your percentage of property assessment as compared to the entire community. So I like to do formulas. So your percentage of property taxes means your assessment value divided by the total assessment value within the municipality. So that's your share of the property taxes. So you take that percentage and apply it against the total municipal tax levy. So that's how it works. So let's go through an example. I like to go through examples just to make it a little bit more concrete. So let's pretend that we're in a community with two identical properties. So the total tax levy for this municipality is $500. So here are two identical homeowners. Their assessments are $100 each. So the way that we would figure out the assessment would be that your fair share is 50% because you have 50% of the property value of your particular community. So each household would pay $250 each year. So that's how the share works. So let's talk about now these concepts. You know, these words get thrown around. It's hard to understand exactly what they mean. So I want to kind of break it down for you. If you go and talk to your assessor, you're going to hear the term market value or fair market value, a fair amount. So this is the official definition of what fair market value means or market value means in the state of Wisconsin. And it has to do with sales prices. So it's the most probable price which a property should bring in a competitive and open market under all conditions requisite to a fair sale. The buyer and seller are each acting prudently and knowledgeably, and there's an assumption that the price is not affected by undue stimulus. So some of the things that they're looking for are they're typically motivated. They're both acting in their best interest. There's reasonable time allowed on the open market. Payment is, standard. There's no type of financing or anything strange around that property purchase. So that's the idea of fair market value. So you're going to hear that a lot when you talk to an assessor. They're going to say, well, you really got to be fair market value. But as we're going to see in a couple of different examples, the key to our assessment process and property tax system is this concept of uniformity. And uniformity means that every property owner should be paying their fair share of property taxes. And we also, so let me go through the examples, then we can talk about the effect of equalization. So the importance of uniformity is that the assessment not only establishes your share of the tax burden, but also helps to determine the municipality's share, right? And all of those impact your individual property tax burden. So let's go through some examples of your individual scenario. So let's talk about the property taxes in the same community. There's two identical properties. What happens if one of the properties is not assessed appropriately? So for example, they should be assessed at $100 per home. But what happens if the assessor puts one of the properties at $25 versus $100? That means that now you're not going to be paying 50-50. You're going to be paying 80% versus 20%. Because what happens is that we take the assessment of the $100 assessed property, which is identical to the other one, and then you divide it by the assessment for the entire community. In that case, that impacts your property tax burden, right? Because this household that's assessed at $100 at fair market value potentially would be paying $400 instead of the $250 that they should be paying. And then the neighboring household, identical, that should be assessed at $100 is now being assessed at $25 and only paying $100 of their burden. So you can see that's not fair anymore. That's not the right way that it should be handled. That's what happens when uniformity is not taking place within a community. But it gets exacerbated even more so when you think about the effect that it has on the municipality's share of the assessment and the tax levy. So let's go through our example of our school district, again, using the simple scenario that we shared before. But what happens again if, for example, Cottage Grove now is being assessed significantly lower than what they should be assessed at? We can see that the same math applies, that now Monona is going to be paying more than their fair share, and Cottage Grove will be paying less than their fair share. So this is a problem. If your assessments are not being done uniformly, it's compounded not just in your individual assessment, but potentially in the municipality's assessment, which obviously gets filtered down to each of us as taxpayers. So let's go back to this concept of uniformity, or right here. So we talked about equalization value. Our property assessment system here in Wisconsin recognizes that assessors don't always get to 100% of market value. We actually assume that they're not going to always be at 100%. So every year the DOR goes through and provides their own estimate of property assessment for each community. And then they adjust it so it can be equalized. So basically, if they identify that a community's assessment is below the market value, they boost it up so there's an apples to apples comparison when it comes to the tax burdens that go cross borders. So really, there's an understanding that while the goal is market value, the reality is that that's not the case all the time. And the DOR comes in and tries to fix it, but it's a global view and it can't fix it 100%. So the closer we can all get our communities to equalization, to uniformity, the better it is for the system as a whole. So let's go on to, I guess I could pause there and see if there are any questions relating to how the system works as a whole.
Thanks, Jen. We don't have any questions on that, but there was one question by Carol asking if the presentation will be available for download after this meeting.
You bet.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Any other questions? You can type them in the chat, or if you want to chime in, we can and ask those questions yourself. We can sit here for a minute or two, or raise your hand.
Okay. Well, let's go on to the next part then. This is really kind of the big picture. This is how it all works. So let's get into your own individual assessment. So how do you assess your property assessment? How do you evaluate the fairness of your property? So I'm sure many of you have gotten notices indicating that your property value has gone up. And considering the current market and the fact that houses are selling at high rates, that's not unexpected. But as you can see, based on the way that the system works, the key thing is making sure that your assessment is uniform or proportionate to the other properties within the community. Because if yours went up and everyone else's stayed the same, then clearly there might be a situation where you're not paying your fair share, right? So that's the core thing you need to look at. So the way that you want to evaluate your assessment is the first step is really identifying your comparables. And comparable properties are properties that are similar to yours, similar in location, similar in structure. So number of bedrooms are critical, number of bathrooms are critical. If there are any unique factors in your home, so if you have a pool, if you're lakeside. So what you really want to do is to find the properties within your community that are the closest to yours, so that you can kind of do a comparison to see how they're assessed as compared to yours. So once you've identified your comparables, you have to go through the process of figuring out how to adjust for the differences in your property. It's going to be very rare that you find identical properties. And I think that one of the ways that I would recommend doing it, and we kind of talked about it before the presentation started, is that the assessor should be able to understand what properties are comparable within the community. Because how are they assessing properties comparably if they don't have that basic understanding? If you go to the Board of Review, which we'll talk about in the future, they should be presenting the comparables that they use to identify your property assessment. And if they cannot do so, then that is going to be a critical issue because it calls into question how they're setting assessments within a community. So what I would really recommend is that you would go to your assessor and ask for that information. What properties are comparable to mine? Which ones did you use in setting the assessment? The sales data for properties within the community. So all of those things that are helpful. And then also seeing how they made adjustments to the properties to make them comparable. So it looks like, Christy, are you?
Yeah, I was going to ask, because I did do that, and I asked, if they could give me specific addresses that were used. And I'm reading the email that I received back. It says municipal assessing is mass assessing and does not work in the same way as a private appraisal where each property is compared to 3 or so comparables. Rather, the properties is statistically analyzed based on all sales of similar properties that have occurred in the municipality in the same neighborhood the previous year. If you have any documentation you would like us to take a look at, please let us know. So I will continue to ask for those addresses because I think that seems like something that should be included with the letter. It would be, really great data to have.
Absolutely. And I think the critical thing that I point to in that response is that, so they're saying they are doing a mass appraisal and they have a way of comparing your property to the similar ones in the community. So why can't they provide you with those addresses? It should be within their system so that it could be easily accessible. And the fact that if an assessor is not able to provide that information, it calls into question what exactly are they doing to make sure that all of the different similarly situated comparables are being handled in the same fashion. And also you should be able to test that, pressure test it individually against yours. So I think it's a very fair thing. It's going to be required as they come forth to justify why their assessment is correct when or if and when you go before the Board of Review. But I guess as you go through and look at your community, I would also try to find those comparables that you understand to be similar to yours. You know your neighborhood, the properties that are similarly situated to yours. So what I would do is start identifying that body or those addresses yourself, and then pulling their assessments so that you can kind of figure out how everything compares to yours.
Okay.
So that's the first step.
Okay.
Once you've done that, and I think the adjustment process is difficult, but just so the closer you can get to your own, so if they're the same bathrooms, same bedrooms, those kinds of things, making the adjustments to that, then if in fact, they're assessing it at fair market value, then the per square foot value of the comparable should be similar to yours on the assessment basis, right? Because it can be difficult because sometimes people just look at the big number, but they're different square footages, right? So you want to make sure to take it as close to apples as you can. So divide it out, figure out per square footage. There's a range, and hopefully there should be a way of just seeing, is it even within the range? Because if it's not, then there's an issue. right? Particularly of importance is to compare your assessment to the assessments that have recently sold. Because oftentimes, so another thing that kind of resonates with the response that you received from the assessor is the fact that, you know, they're comparing it to things that have recently sold. One of the core concerns that I've identified within the City of Monona is the fact that the assessor was only really adjusting properties that recently sold or properties that had a building permit or something associated with it. So there were some properties that may not have been reassessed really or revisited individually for, you know, 40 years, if there had never been a sale, if it's been in the family. And one of the arguments that the assessor brought to me when I identified a significant differences between myself and different comparables was, oh, well, that property sold during the market downturn. That explains why it's being assessed so low. That's obviously not appropriate because during a market downturn, every property should be taken to the same level so that we're all being assessed uniformly. So if certain properties are being assessed differently depending on when they are bought or sold, then that obviously creates a uniformity concern because identical properties might be assessed at significantly different levels. So something that's critical to look at when you evaluate your own property because it's a concern that I've noted across the board here in Monona.
Okay.
So
hey, Jen, we have a few questions, and I'm not sure if you can answer this first one. Do you
Sure.
know if Cottage Grove is using the same assessor as Monona?
I can tell you that because I hope I can share my screen. So our assessor is Accurate Assessor, and if you just Google it, you'll find it. So they have a website that you can go to, and this is one of the resources that we'll touch upon as well. But I guess the best way to do this is probably, it identifies the various communities that they're assessing. So you can see that Cottage Grove is not one of the communities that are being assessed by this assessing firm. So absolutely, that is one of the critical things that the Department of Revenue identifies, that different assessors may assess different communities at different levels. So that's where the equalization concept comes into play, where they attempt as best they can, because they're looking globally. They're not looking at those individual properties, but they do their best to try to get everything to apples. But when there are systemic issues like what I'm seeing in Monona, it makes it very difficult. So it's hard, it's going to be hard for there to be a fix of that. And so there's going to be issues. And I don't know which way it goes because I haven't done the entire review of the state of Wisconsin, but I can tell you that there are going to be concerns and we're not going to be able to, the DOR won't be able to fix it based on, you know, what I'm seeing. But okay, let's continue on.
Can I ask there was one more question, Jen.
Of course.
It's from Anna. How do you find square footage, bedrooms, etc. on property?
Absolutely.
Is there an accurate website? And Carol mentioned accessdane.com.
Yes. So we're going to get into that on the resources, but let's hold on it and we can talk about what type of resources we can use to do this evaluation.
Okay.
So let's move forward. And this is where we're on the next slide. So the official resources, I've created a link so that when you receive this presentation, you'll be able to explore these resources yourself. But the first resource I want to point out is property assessment is governed by the statute of Wisconsin. So the laws tell us how this works. The Department of Revenue, the law basically says that assessors throughout the communities, you have to follow the rules set forth by the Department of Revenue, and particularly the Property Assessment Manual. So I'm going to click on this and it's going to take you to a link, the Department of Revenue, the official source. It has a lot of different documents that you can look at that will help to provide additional information about the system, provide you with, a lot of this is not going to be relevant, like the manufacturing is not going to be relevant for your purposes unless you're a manufacturer as well. But I'd like to point out specifically the guide for property owners is for property owners. It's kind of a do-it-yourself guide provided by the Department of Revenue. So I would point you there, take a look at that. It may give you more information that will help you as you evaluate, go through this process. The equalized value provides a little bit more information about the equalization idea and the fact that the DOR recognizes that in most cases, assessors are not going to be 100% on fair market, and that there's a process in place to fix it, to try to fix it. But here's where I want you to look: the Wisconsin Property Assessment Manual. It's huge, but it is the Bible, essentially, the guiding principles for property assessment here in Wisconsin. So click on it, take a look at it. It gives you a lot of information, including how you can adjust properties. When you look at the property record card, which is going to be another resource that I'm going to point you to, so I kind of chuckled at the idea of accurate, because the property assessment card is populated by the assessor. So to the extent that that information is on there, it's been populated by that entity. For me personally, I know that our property assessment record card was wrong. We have a Tudor style home. They indicated that our second floor was larger than our first floor in square footage. So, really examine, we do not have a T-shaped house. I don't know if you know Tudors, but they go like this. So that was a critical error that they were relying on, that, that they put on paper. So maybe not accurate, but it's like the official record that is on the Access Dane website as well, because they take it from the local assessors, and the local assessors have the duty to get the information right. So really, that's where I'm going to point you to get to the data. But the Property Assessment Manual gives you a lot of information on how you can adjust properties to get to comparables, to get to apples to apples. Let's go back. Let's go to the property record card, because that's really where the meat of it is. So this is what a property record card looks like. It's on the Accurate Assessor website. This is for the city hall. You can see the address. It's an exempt property, so they don't have as much information as they typically would. But you would typically get a photograph of it, the owner's name, legal description, but the key things that you're looking for are going to be right here, the building description. So you want to look for your property, the closer to when it was built for your comparable. So if our house was built in 1920s. So if we can find properties that were built in 1920s, arguably the condition is fairly similar, right? Because it's about the same age potentially. The stories might be something that's important. So if you have a 3-story, you might not want to compare it to a ranch, right? Because it's not exactly comparable. The grade, and that's critical. So the grade is the quality of material and workmanship, and it's basically graded from A to E. So the assessor themselves have said that your property is an A property, number 1, great property, or an E property, falling apart. The materials are not the best, right? So that's something you can use to evaluate your property. And the Property Tax Assessment Manual tells you what the difference between those grades are. So that's one of the adjustments I would recommend you make on your comparable, at the very least. The CDU is another situation where an assessor has said, in my professional opinion, and again, the CDU is condition, desirability, or usefulness of the improvement. So you want to make sure that your comparables are either the same or make the adjustment as recommended by the Wisconsin Property Assessment Manual to make sure that you're kind of comparing apples to apples before you get to the square footage. So you've got they've got different conditions. So they go through and identify that, the interior is this condition, the kitchen's this condition, the bathroom. So the closer you can get to those qualifications on your property, the more comparable your property is, and the less adjustments you need to make. But this is where you would look to try to figure out, so I've identified a few comparables. How comparable are they really to mine? This is where the square footage would typically be, and they usually split it out by floor. So you can get a better sense for what type of property you're looking at. And then it also talks about the permit and construction history. It talks about the permit amounts, so you can get some context around that. The sales history is located down here as well. And then you also get information about the land. So when you're looking at your property comparables, you have to separately evaluate the land and the improvements. The land is really about, kind of desirability, right? Because where your land is located kind of determines how desirable the land might be. So when you're looking at the land values, you're going to want to kind of understand it on a per square foot basis, and then kind of compare it to, your own. But when it comes to the property assessment, you're going to need to make some adjustments to the assessment before you figure out the per square foot value comparison to your own. And then here at the bottom, it just summarizes what exactly it looks like. So that's the property tax assessment card. And here's the way that you can get it most easily. Once you've gone around, figured out in your community, in your neighborhood, what the comparables are, you can go here and then, oh, I'm sorry. Let's start from the beginning. I would Google Accurate Assessor. That's how I find it every time. And then Accurate Assessor is the first one that pops up. For whatever reason, it's no longer accessible on their website, but it's still accessible via the search. If you click property search, you get to this page, then go to Monona. You can enter in the street name number. So, and then it pops up a parcel and you click on this and then it'll open up with all the information you need, include that's filled out a little bit more thoroughly. So
I have put those in the chat as well. So I'm putting in the record search link right now for Monona.
Fantastic. And it will also be accessible on the presentation so that you can click through. Although I would really recommend you go through that process of searching for it, because I don't know that the link will get you exactly where you want to go. So that is one way. I mean, when it comes to a uniformity issue, it's really about understanding what the assessor is doing in your community. And they are an agent of a municipality. They have a public duty to provide information under open records. They need to be able to justify what they're doing and why. And that's their obligation as basically a public servant agent, right? So absolutely, you need to ask for the information. They need to give it to you. And if they're not willing to give it to you, then an open record request is one of the ways that you can kind of get the documents that you are entitled to. The other document I would point you to, especially as you're kind of looking at uniformity concerns, is the assessment roll. The assessment roll identifies the assessed value of all taxable property within a community, and you're required to have it. So for Accurate Assessor, for example, they have right here in this area a roll book, right? And then you can click on each of them and you can find all the assessed values for your entire community by parcel. So that's one way that you can kind of see what are the different comparable properties that you've identified being assessed at, kind of to get a global understanding of how it looks. So you scroll down to Monona and then you can click here and this is what it looks like. So you can see here's the property, the description, the acres, land value, improvement value, total value. So it's pretty straightforward, but I think it's an easy summary. So you can just kind of whip through and see, if you know particular addresses, you can search for them and then you can get the information. This does not, however, reflect any adjustments that may be made at open book. So if you've gone and talked to the assessor, there may be changes at the end or gone through board of review. This is not updated for that, right? So just keep that in mind. But this is what the assessor determined on the front end as to what should be the appropriate assessments within the community. Okay. Another thing, so we talked about these comparables. And again, even if they're assessing using some kind of statistical process, it still has to bear out when you evaluate it against actual properties. So they need to tell you what they're doing and what class of properties you're being compared against to ensure that you're being assessed appropriately. So let's talk about what we've been provided in the past and what is pretty standard when it comes to going forth to a board hearing. So the assessor last year identified these comps for our property. So we've got the subject property here, And then they identified what their comparables were for our property. And this type of information is critical because it shows what type of adjustments they make for different types of features. So you can see, for example, we've got acreage, we've got land value, style, years built. So I think the critical thing about this evaluation is to understand how they're adjusting for different factors and being able to then apply that to your own comparables, right? So if they say that, you know, for example, we were built in 1932, according to this particular setting, the comparable number 1 was built in 1948. They're saying that the adjustment should be 8,000. Understanding why it's 8,000 and then applying that to your own comparables is kind of the way that you can evaluate how that they're doing things appropriately across the board. One thing to look out for is that under our spreadsheet, they identified the grades for these particular comparables, and they're all identical on this particular form. When we checked it against their own database, that was not the case. The grades were not the same. So whenever the assessor gives you information, especially in this community in Monona, please double check it against their own resources to make sure that the information is being conveyed correctly. For example, while it says C for all of them, I think that ours was a C and everybody else was a higher grade. And that should have caused for an adjustment to those comparables that would have changed the values. So keep that in mind, test everything against their own database, and also print off and take pictures, you know, get your evidence together, because as soon as we pointed that out, the data changed. And of course, one of the things that we're going to be testing is why did it change? What other properties did it change for, or was it just the assessment comparables that you had selected for me? Because if they're doing that, there's got to be a basis for it. They either visited it and determined that they were wrong. They have to explain why they were wrong then, and justify why they made changes. They can't just change things for their own benefit. So keep that in mind.
Jen, can I ask a question quick?
Absolutely.
Okay, there's one that I'm looking at using for a comparable for myself. The square footage is very similar. My house is a 3-bedroom, 1 bath. The one I'm looking at is a 3-bedroom, 2 bath. We're both graded at C. My assessed improvement is 164,100, and their assessed improvement is 81,100. It is a lakefront home. Is that a good comparable for me? Because I mean, theirs is less than half assessed as far as improvement value as mine.
I think that I can't really opine without digging in more closely, but like I said, the lakefront aspect is something that relates to the property value, right? The real property value. So when it comes to the improvement itself, I think that it would be appropriate if it's the same quality, if it's the same size, if it's the same features. You know, those are the things that matter when it comes to evaluating whether the property is appropriate as a comparable to yours. Okay. I think that one of the big questions I might ask if I was in your situation would be, how does the assessor adjust for an extra bathroom, right? Because they can probably give you the number. So if they say, you know, an extra bathroom means another $5,000 on your assessment, then understanding that is helpful. So use the assessor as a resource, because really we're pressure testing their methodology. And they have to have some way of adjusting it. Otherwise, they can't get to the right answer, right? So there must be something within their statistical system that adjusts for different sizes in bathrooms. So once you understand that, you can kind of apply that across your comparables to ensure that you're kind of getting to an apples to apples analysis.
Okay. And I did ask the city staff about that. And what was told to me, and this is basically a direct quote, was that it has been determined in Monona that people buy their lakefront home not for the home, but for the land. And so they assess the land at a certain value, but the home is not assessed at the same value as, say, my home, which is not on the lake.
Then I would ask them to point to the legal basis for that conclusion and identify where in the Wisconsin laws that is appropriate.
Okay.
I would ask for maybe case law. I would ask for property tax assessment manual, citations. They cannot just make rules up. The rules are there and they should be following them, because if that's the way they're handling it in Monona, but not handling it in Madison, then how are we creating uniformity across the entire state?
Yeah.
There's no ability for individual assessment teams to make different determinations on how they want to do things within specific communities.
Yeah. And my question was, it's been determined by whom? And I didn't really get an answer on that. So I was curious if that was in the laws, or like that could be so wildly different.
Absolutely.
Okay.
What other questions do we have on this particular slide?
Right now, there's no questions in the chat. So
very good. Okay, let's go to the next page, which is unofficial resources, because we've got the official resources, but it is online is such a gift, right? Because there's so much out there. You know, you can see the properties that are for sale, what they're for sale for, what they're selling for. There's more information than ever before. So please utilize that resource and see what's out there, right? Also, you know, a lot of the accurate assessor information's out there. All of the assessors are assessing teams throughout the community or throughout the state are publishing information on the website, right? So these are all resources that used to be hard to get at, but now they're here. So utilize them and learn as much as you can. The other thing that's so important is that oftentimes the assessment companies are from out of the area and covering communities across the state. We saw the list of communities that are being assessed by Accurate Assessor. So you citizen, know your community. You probably have a deeper and better understanding of your neighboring properties. So be confident in that fact. You're probably selecting better. Oftentimes they're going to choose comparable properties, quote unquote, from different communities, when there are a lot of different properties within the community that are going to be comparable to your own. So, you know, as you go through the process, you know, it's intimidating sometimes to go against somebody who's an expert, right? But I want to point out that, and this is what Christy alluded to, bad assessors resort to the expert card or indicated that they're following an unspecified law when questioned. And last year when we went to the Board of Assessors, I sat through all of the presentations, and every time the assessor was against the wall being asked a very legitimate question, they resorted to this, well, we're following the laws here in Wisconsin, and wouldn't answer the questions that were being asked. And it was unbelievably frustrating for me, because to see them throw out this expert card as a way to cover the fact that they're not doing their job well. All right, so any questions about this? I think the big picture is that you know your community, feel confident in understanding, you know, which comparables are better probably than the ones selected by the assessor. All right, so let's talk about how to appeal your property assessment. Now you've done your work, you've identified that perhaps your assessment is not comparable or uniform, or it's not uniform with the comparables within your community. And you've seen what impact that has on your individual assessment and potentially your community's share of the tax burden here in Wisconsin. So in many ways, we have a duty as citizens to kind of challenge those assessments so that we can ensure that our assessment process is being done lawfully and that everybody is paying their fair share. So let's talk about the process of appealing. As soon as you receive your assessment notice, you need to identify the scheduled date because it's critical. They call it jurisdictional under law. So like in the legal field, I guess, it basically means that if you miss these deadlines, you lose your right to move forward. So it's critical that you understand what the deadlines are. So the first step is to identify the Board of Review meeting. And some communities, not Monona, but some communities have a Board of Assessor that you have to apply to first. So keep that in mind to those who might not be in Monona. but you got to follow all the steps. So the first step, if you want to appeal, is you must file your notice of intention to object at least 48 hours before the first board of review meeting. So I always go, it's not necessarily super clear, but I would recommend 48 business hours, right? So if the meeting's on Monday, you want to do it by Thursday, right? To have that 48 hours in advance. And then you must also then file your objection form, which you can get from the city within the first 2 hours of the first board meeting. So it's very, I mean, to be honest, it might just be easy if you wanted to do it and you're ready to do it, just to file your notice of intent and your objection form at the same time, 48 hours beforehand. So basically, depending on the number of objections, you might get heard that day, or you might be scheduled out for a subsequent date. So it really depends on the community. But these are things you need to put on your calendar and you cannot miss. So the next step is, I guess at the board of review, you should be prepared to present your basis for why you're overassessed. And when it comes to a uniformity issue, you're going to want to identify why their comparables aren't appropriate. And basically, you're going to want to identify the reasons why their process did not work for your property. I think that the critical thing, the big recommendation, is to hopefully in advance get their comparables and their analysis so that you can really evaluate and understand it. Because I think it's going to be very difficult for most property owners to do that on the fly. So if you know what they're using, then you can already have evaluated it and determined why it wasn't appropriate. You also need to be prepared to bring forth your own comparables and say, these are the comparables, these are why these are good comparables, and this is the difference between my comparable or my property and the way that the other assessments were done. So that is the big picture issue when it comes to uniformity clause issues. So I guess to back it up, there are two ways, I guess, to approach the meeting. The first is if you're assuming that everyone's at fair market value, then you need to be able to identify why your assessment is not at fair market value. But I don't think that's going to be the argument, especially in this scenario. I think in Monona, the key issue is uniformity, because some people are being assessed high, some people are being assessed low, and that's not the way it can go. So that's why I'm saying that in Monona, fair market value is not the argument. It's really about how do you compare to everybody else within the community, as particularly the comparables within the community, and how did the assessor treat us differently than everyone else? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because especially with the market having gone up, it's going to be probably, I doubt that we're going to have situations where you're really going to have a winning case that, everyone's being assessed at fair market value and that you're not, that's going to be the difficult argument. So at the board of review, it can be difficult to get relief there. I've found that to be the case. As a lawyer, it's a little bit easier to get. So when I've represented clients, typically I'm able to get something at that stage, but most homeowners don't have much success at that stage, unfortunately. It can be very difficult. So you may need to be prepared to potentially take it to the next level. So this is kind of the process of appealing your property assessment from that point on. Hopefully the board of review will be more open to it this year, but I can't guarantee that. Like I said, it can be very difficult. So the appeal options from the board of review, there are 3 different paths you can take. 2 of them go to circuit court, 1 of them goes to the DOR. When it comes to the circuit court, you can approach it 2 different ways. The first is called the de novo, and it's second on my list, but it's a situation where it's an entirely new trial. It goes before a judge. what you need to do in order to go through this process. All of these require that you have gone before the board, but the de novo requires you to file a claim with the city that next January, by the next January 31st, that states the claim as being an excessive assessment. And from there, they can either accept it or deny it. If it's denied, then you have to file a court action within 90 days after the municipality denies the claim. And then you go to court. You have the power of discovery, which is really helpful. So Christy's talking about how difficult it is to get information sometimes. Well, then you go to the court and the court will order all the information that you need to do your evaluation to be provided to you as part of the court hearing. The good thing about this is that you have a judge who's going to look at this case. They won't necessarily be within the community. So, they're going to be kind of open-minded as to, whether it's right or wrong. It gives you a chance to kind of call witnesses, including expert witnesses or the assessor themselves, to testify as to how they do assessment work here in the city of Monona. So I think that is definitely the way to go versus certiorari, which is a situation where you send the record at the board of review to the court to review if an error was made by the board of review. And again, typically it's going to be difficult for a property owner to do it this way, but it must be filed within 90 days after you receive notice from the board. And then the last option is to file with the DOR within 20 days of delivery of the board of review determination. And I haven't gone through that route, so I don't have much to say about it. But I think the right answer is, if you have to move forward, would be under one of the certiorari or de novo action. But so that is kind of the big picture of how property tax works, how to evaluate your own assessment. I'd like to open it up. I know there's a lot of information provided.
There is one question in the chat, and I'm not sure if you'll know this one either. It is asking if Cottage Grove is assessed every year like Monona.
I am not familiar with how Cottage Grove is being assessed. I do know that the law does not require it to be reassessed every single year. So some communities do, some communities do not. Monona indicates that they reassess every year. I could look really quickly. I'm sure that information would be readily available via a Google search, which is, again, a great resource.
Yeah. I worked with some residents in Monona that when they bought their house, it was on a channel and there was water. They could bring a boat in. And now something has changed and the channel is dry. And so they were being assessed as waterfront. They're still being assessed as waterfront, even though boats cannot get through there, not even like a kayak or a canoe. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that those types of changes in condition would absolutely impact the value of a property. And I would definitely take a case to the board of review and highlight that and ask for relief so that you're being assessed appropriately.
Jen, when if you're approaching someone at your city hall or your village hall, is it typically the city clerk that you're talking with, or you're talking with the finance director? Who do you email or reach out to on staff?
Sure. So when it comes to filing a claim with the board of review, that's through the city clerk. If it's looking for information about how the assessment is being done, it should go directly to the assessing entity. So Accurate Assessor for Monona.
But like maybe getting the forms. I see Carol posted in the chat that they do have the forms available at City Hall.
Yes.
So maybe about the forms or your meeting date, would that be city clerk?
Yes.
And then Nate has asked, is it common practice to adjust land value by a straight percentage across the board? All waterfront land in Monona went up 10% this year. So is it common practice to adjust land value by a straight percentage across the board? All waterfront land in Monona went up 10% this year.
It depends on, it depends on if the properties are comparable, right? So as you know, not all lake property is the same, right? The view might be different, the usability might be different. As Christy indicated, some property might not even be waterfront at this point, because if it's a creek, it's not necessarily the same utility as, you know, maybe a boatable lake, right? So it's hard to give an answer, but I think that anytime there's something across the board, there's room for error, right? Because that might not be appropriate. So it really would take some evaluation as to how did they decide that it should be 10%. Really, the market should be telling us what's happening, and they can't just say, well, 10% across the board because we need to increase it, right? They need to have some kind of database or data points to justify why 10% is appropriate.
And hey, Jen, this is Nate. I put the question into the chat, and what I didn't put into the chat was all of the waterfront properties went up 10% or within, you know, a fraction of a percent of that, whereas the land value on Monona residential property that isn't on water stayed flat, while all of the improved values, most of the improved values went up for all properties in Monona, but the waterfront land specifically went up 10% across the board.
Right, right. And I guess the question would be, right, too, was it across, so it's basically 10% on the improvements and the land value. So I guess what's the basis, you know, go ahead, Nate, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say that specifically on the land value. So
okay.
I pulled the full roll and compared to the 2021 values, and it was 10% on the land across the board. Whereas
Also,
the improvements were different percentages, and I haven't, you know, compared the conditions yet to see if there was some pattern in it, but definitely on the land, it was a straight 10% increase across the board for everything on water.
Sure. Actually, Nate, and this may apply to others who have waterfront property, but the city assessor has developed their own process of evaluating land value on the lake. And it's actually prejudicial to smaller landowners. So basically, it might be something that we can talk about offline, but they have a formula that they use that allegedly incorporates some type of diminishing returns, so that if you have more lakefront property, it actually becomes less valuable, which I think is ludicrous from a philosophical basis, but also there's no basis for it as far as I can understand within assessment practices. Yeah, and violates Wisconsin law, which under the property assessment manual. So the property assessment manual states how waterfront property should be assessed. So you might want to look at that, Nate.
Okay, maybe we should chat offline. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I am one of those small frontage owners who also look at those people with 150 feet of frontage who are assessed at a fraction of my assessment.
Absolutely. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's prejudicial to smaller property owners, and it's a problem. Do we have any other questions, Christy?
There's not, but I'm developing a couple as we're talking. One thing is, in a conversation I had with our past mayor, he had told me that the way, and things may have changed because you stated that Monona is reassessed every year. And what he had told me was that 25% of the homes were reassessed annually. So then in 4 years, the entire city was assessed.
And that's usually how, that's typically how I've seen communities handle it when it comes to communities that are not reassessed every year. But according to, I don't know, this is the form that was sent by Accurate Assessor along with our assessments. It's a pink paper that you may have with your database. And it basically indicates that an annual revaluation is performed every year within your community. It means that all properties will be reviewed and assessed to fair market value annually. And So that's what they've represented. And I do not believe that that's the case based on what I've been seeing, because I don't think that everybody is being brought to the same levels, but they're using that as their talking point.
Okay.
At the end of the day, I think you're allowed to do kind of what you've talked about, Christy, which is cyclically handling it, but that's not what they're saying they're doing.
And do you have any thoughts on, you know, some cities have an assessment department within their city hall, so they have staff versus a contractor that, you know, or a vendor, an outside vendor that we're using. In your experience, is there one that's better than the other or more consistent?
I think that there are assessing companies that are better than others. I don't necessarily have a good opinion on whether it makes sense to have an internal department versus an external. If you have the right partner, I think that it's fine, right, to handle it the way that you, to have somebody, an external party, handle the assessment practices and process within your community. But you have to make sure to have the right partner, because if you don't, then you end up with situations like this.
Okay. And I know I've gotten this question a lot. How much do we pay accurate assessors? And I'm looking at an email on May 5th, 2021. I had asked our city administrator that, and he said $33,800 annually for each year of their contract. So in case people are curious about that. All right. Well, this was so informational. I am really grateful to you, because I actually was not going to really bring forward my assessment, but after hearing you know your information, I realized that I actually do need to bring this forward to the board of review. So I hope it was informational for others, and like we said, we have recorded this, so I'll have a link and I'll put it on the Facebook event page. Feel free to email me info@goforthmonona.com if you're not on Facebook and you need that link. That's info@goforthmonona.com. Yeah, any last questions out there, anyone? Otherwise, Jen, thank you so much for your time and expertise. It was really great having you here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I will provide Christy with the PowerPoint so that can be disseminated. And feel free to reach out to me. I'm not practicing in property tax. I'm not taking on clients. This is just informational. I'm happy to share my information with you, or my background or knowledge, and to help you if you need assistance as you work through the process.
Thanks, Jen.
You bet.
Thank you.
Hey, Jen, one question just came through. Someone asked me, what is the first step to call Accurate Appraiser to get their comparables and their analysis?
What's the first step? I think you've identified the step, which would be to call and ask. I think that what I would recommend is to put everything in writing, though, too, so that maybe email and specifically ask for things so that you have documentation on what was asked and what was said. I think it can be very frustrating to have situations where things change, right? So definitely writing is key.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's sometimes you feel like it's just kind of a dog chasing his tail, because you keep asking and you keep getting, an answer that says, basically in short, we're not going to give you the comparables.
Yeah, well, they can only say that for so long.
Okay, persistence is key.
Yeah. And
All
actually, the right answer might be that if you're not getting an answer, the open record request is one of the options, one of your tools. And they are an agent of your municipality. They have an obligation to provide documents under Wisconsin law. And they need to be able to justify how they're doing things. And we have a right to test that as well, to ensure that it's being done appropriately for our community.
Yeah, and you stated this during this session, and I've had this exact conversation with so many folks, is that, it's not that we're opposed to paying property taxes. We know we have amazing amenities in Monona, and we love that. It's just that we want to see fairness.
Absolutely. It's about the fair share and making sure that everyone is not just within Monona, but making sure that Monona is paying our fair share of the state burdens, right? So if we're being misassessed, then that impacts potentially what we're paying as a whole community. So just keep that in mind, that it's really, really, I think, a civic duty for us to continue to question, to make sure that we're being assessed appropriately within the community. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way that you can attest it. You can't fight the entire system, you can only fight your own.
Yeah. And I really appreciated you kind of giving that big picture view of how it impacts, when we have a conjoined school district, and two different communities. So I appreciated that information as well.
Absolutely. And it compounds when you think about the county tax, right?
Oh, yeah.
So they do their best to try to fix it, but at the end of the day, I think everybody has a duty to make sure that we're doing it the right way within our community and others within their community, so that we can all be paying our fair share.
Absolutely. So, well, thank you again. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.